Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this January 3rd, 2018. See, I didn't forget. I said 2018 day on our calendar. Back from a long holiday. Hope yours was well. And today we're going to talk about the criminal history of the papacy. And I'm going to take this, a lot of the information I ran across over the break, an article by a guy by the name of Tony Bushby. And this was written way, way back in 2006, but I'll tell you what, not many people have read it, and especially Catholics, people who grow up in the Catholic faith have little idea of what their popes and the true history of their popes is all about. That's what we're going to talk about today. But before I do that, let me thank all my listeners from 2017, and stick with me. In 2018, it's going to be a good year and a lot of great information. And a lot of people ask me, what good is all this information if we can't do anything about it? Well, little do you know that just by digging in to a lot of what we talk about on this show, which has been dubbed, in fact, it's the Investigative Journal. We're going on, God, we started this in 2005, and it's still going, despite advertisers, despite the crooked media and the mainstream, despite the crooked alternative media, who gives you just half-truths and fails to really discuss the spiritual controllers of the New World Order, which we know as the Vatican and the Jesuit Order specifically. And so people ask, why, what good is it if we can't do anything about it? And the real point is you can. And just by understanding, you basically are on a path to freedom. And freedom comes from within, not from without. And so stick with me. And we're not going to get out there and do any rallies. We're not going to rush Washington. We're not going to go to the foot of the Vatican steps and demand justice. All we're going to do is look into past history, look into what's going on today, and make sense out of this crazy world, which is what we try to do on this show, which has been dubbed the alternative to the alternative news for good reason, the alternative to the alternative media. And so as we move on into this year, let's not forget the importance of relating all of this stuff together from political to spiritual and using the Bible as a guidepost for many things. And like I said before, it's the enemy that we're looking at here. We're looking at what really is going on behind the scenes. And someone asked me, well, where do you start? And I said, well, listen, the most important thing is that you, as a person, understand the hierarchy of the faith you was brought into, and also understand the hierarchy and the history of your country. And those two things will lead you into many directions. And if you stick to that, wow, what you can learn is amazing. And it's basically opening up your mind. You got to keep an open mind in many things. Like over the holidays, I had a discussion about the flat earth, and people called me crazy, of course, at the dinner table. And I laughed it off and just looked the next day as I looked at the horizon and started to say, boy, I'll tell you what, people, you have a lot to learn, and so do I. So let's get at it this year. Criminal History of the Papacy. Tony Bushby wrote this, and I want to paraphrase some of it, talk about some things. And remember that the papal office has really an unparalleled record of corruption, criminality over the centuries. It's not just today. It's covered up well today. And the true history of the popes is one of scandals, debauchery, cruelty, reigns of terror, warfare, and moral depravity. You Catholics, that's what your church is all about. I was one. I was a Catholic brought into the faith, brought into this idea of faith that Catholicism throws on you, but really all they ask you is to have faith in the Pope, have faith in the priest. We will get you to heaven. And I'll tell you what, I learned otherwise. But most Catholics, according to Tony Bushby, go through life and never hear a word of reproach for any pope or member of the clergy. Except today you hear a lot about, the sexual scandals. But let's look back into recorded history of the lives of the clerical hierarchy. It bears no resemblance to its modern-day portrayal. And the true stories of the popes in particular are among the most misrepresented in religious history. Why, folks? Because they control what you read. Yes, they control what you read so you don't even get the truth. And once you delve into it, you're shocked, as I was, when I lived in Rome for 6 years and learned about it firsthand. Now, the Catholic historian and Archbishop of New York, John Cardinal Farley, in 1916 subtly admitted that, quote, old legends of their dissolute lives, this is the popes, may be partly true, that they didn't sternly insist upon sexual virtue and injustice was a general license of the papal court, but it is probable that moral improvement was at the vanguard of their thinking. That was in the Catholic Encyclopedia in 1897. But the real character, says Bushby, of the popes as a rule has been so falsely represented that people don't know that so many popes were not only decadent, but were also the most savage and perfidious of military strategists ever known. Let me interject. I talked about the military strategy of the Jesuit order, since they were formed in the 1500s to basically pound out, trounce out, kill out the Protestant Reformation, which they've done a good job. But we talked much about their strategy in the American Revolutionary War, i.e., Jesuit General Lorenzo Ricci. But the military strategist of the popes hundreds of years ago is no different. Cardinal Farley added this comment, Pope, quote, the popes were temporal rulers of the civil territory, and they naturally had recourse to force that the reestablishment or extend the states of the church until the conclusion of peace was confirmed. Their attempts to purify particularly the Duchy of Rome caused them considerable distress and the need to resort to violence, but always on the side of mercy. Lives were lost in the service of the truth, but the legal basis for the Christian church to hold and transmit properties for the benefit of revenues was given to them, the popes, by Emperor Constantine in 312. Catholic Encyclopedia, page 157, 169. Okay. And that was, we talked much about the changeover from, the emperor, the Roman Empire into the Vatican, which takes on the same role as the Roman Empire did, but cloaking it in Christianity. First of all, let's be clear. Catholicism is not Christianity, and to bring those two words together is ridiculous. But Bushby goes on to say the comments of the cardinal warrant your attention, folks. For within them rests a little-known story of the leaders of the Christian religion. Now, this is not, I'm going to say the Catholic Church, because you can't mingle these words together, and reveals that today's presentation of the popes as incorruptible moral oracles is very untrue. And then ask yourself, why do all the leaders of the world, including presidents of the United States, kiss the feet of these corruptible moral degenerates? Why? Because they're one of them. They're just like them. Now, the hidden history of doctrinal foundations that permitted a papal alliance with conflict and licentiousness, and to what degree decadence among the clergy is partly true, provides for really an extraordinary study, one that has no precedent or parallel in the history of world religions. In the preface to an official papal record commissioned for publication by the Holy See called, quote, The Popes, a concise biographical history of to the Christian reader, is tactfully prepared for some upcoming and unpleasant facts about popes with the apologetic admission, quote, "Some Catholics may find surprises when they read the papal biographies in this book. The part we are accustomed to think of the Pope playing at the church may need a little adjustment." And that's in The Popes, A Concise Biographical History, Eric John and Burns and Oakes, publishers to the Holy See, London, 1964, page 19, published under Georgius L. Craven, if you want to check it out. The comment provides readers with a note of caution in dealing with papal history. But in this biographical history of the Holy See, you did not think it prudent to publish full details of the true nature of the papal court. Its real history is intermingled with, quote, "centuries of trafficking in ecclesiastical appointments, deceit, scandals, immorality, aggressions, frauds, murder, and cruelty. And the true disposition of the popes is knowingly falsely presented by the church today." A History of the Popes, Dr. Joseph McCabe. You can get some of that information. He wrote that in he lived from 1867 to 1955. And for centuries, the church maintained a comprehensive account of the lives of the popes who, up until the 11th century, called themselves ecumenical patriarchs. And amazing excesses are recorded. Official Catholic records provide extraordinary confessions of wickedness in the whole Christian or Catholic clergy, and the implications surrounding this knowledge begin to assume major new proportions when considered in light of the central claim of unquestionable piety in the clerical hierarchy. Now, we're not even getting in to the spiritual aspect of the Antichrist, which is pinpointed by the Protestant reformers as the Vatican organization. And interestingly enough, there was a TV series. I think there were 6 episodes. In fact, there were 6 episodes regarding this in a show called In Search of God, and this was narrated by Morgan Freeman. Now, in this series, Morgan Freeman in one episode starts talking about the Antichrist, in search of the Antichrist, and of course, it's not the Vatican, and it goes hand in hand with what the Jesuits conspired to present to the masses about the Antichrist being a person in the future that's going to come on this earth. And they also had another one about one in the past. So that show really was probably funded by the Vatican, by the way. So In Search of God, check it out. Morgan Freeman did that 6-episode series. You can get it on Netflix. Now, remember, the editorial committees of the Catholic Encyclopedia claim their volumes are, quote, "the exponent of Catholic truth," and what is presented in this overview is assembled primarily for those records and without prejudice. In the same spirit, we also have available several papal diaries, letters, and reports from foreign ambassadors at the Holy See to their governments, monastic documents, senatorial Roman records, as well as access to the official and ancient registers of the ecclesiastical courts of London. Also of great help in this investigation was the availability of the original version of Diderot's Encyclopedia, and that Pope Clement ordered destroyed. That was in 1758, or during his reign, Pope Clement XIII, destroyed immediately after its publication in 1759. These documents uniformly report a condition of centuries of extraordinary debasement in the papal hierarchy, and when considered in conjunction with the circumstances of their production, their contents can only be classed as astounding. The pretended holiness and piety of the popes, as publicly presented today, is not represented in the records of history, and that provides proof of the dishonesty of the Church's own portrayal. Pious Catholic historian and author Bishop Frothingham extended this summary of Christian leaders up to this time, and he said, "Many of the popes were men of the most abandoned lives, Some were magicians, occultists. Others were noted for sedition, war, slaughter, and every other vice known to man. Others were not even members of Christ, but the basest of criminals and enemies of godliness. Some were children of their father, the devil. Most were men of blood. Some were not even priests. Others were heretics. If the Pope be a heretic, he is ipso facto no Pope. The Cradle of Christ, you can find that, Bishop Frothingham, 1877. See also the Catholic Encyclopedia, page 700 to 703. Now, let's look at this. Just think about what I said there. And think about what the Pope is considered today in the mainstream media by our political leaders. What it's telling you is that there is a push, the Vatican-led New World Order, working together to create a world of control. A world where you will lose all your rights, all your freedoms, and basically they're doing it through deception. You don't read any of this anymore. Isn't it interesting? You can get this stuff in the early 1800s, in the early 1900s. There were even newspapers in America talking openly about Rome's role in destroying this country. But how come nothing today? How come absolutely nothing? And that's really what we do on this show. It is the most vital of all information, but yet you are pigeonholed into a position where they have deceived so many people that the message is muted and only given to a select few. And that comes with the territory. If this were made mainstream, if the debate was made mainstream, their whole New World Order would crumble. The reason being is facts show that what we say on this show should be brought into the public debate. There's enough information, enough reliable information to bring this out to the open debate. So you have to ask yourself, why isn't it? And the reason is the same reason that Pope Clement XIII destroyed that book that was critical of the Vatican back hundreds of years ago. Because if people understand the truth, they will not have one church standing in America anymore, and they know it. So they have to work hand in hand with our government leaders. And as the years go by, you see how it's happened. Now, recently, just over the holidays, I took a trip to the Reagan Library, which is a beautiful museum. And if you've never been there, I recommend you go. And it's in Simi Valley, California. And I went there and walked through the whole thing, spent a couple hours there. And they begin with Ronald Reagan's life, and they take it all the way to the end. And he lived a remarkable life. But I can remember that one of the things they didn't talk about, really, was that Ronald Reagan was the first president to reinstitute diplomatic relations with the Vatican, formal relations, bringing a Vatican council here in Washington, headquarters, since the 1800s when they were caught red-handed trying to kill President Lincoln, or killing President Lincoln, trying many times prior. That story has been muted. And our patriots back then cut off diplomatic relations with the Vatican. So what does Reagan do? He reinstitutes it. So he was one of them. He was bringing the Vatican-led New World Order one step closer to their goal. And guess what? Not a single word that I see, and I'm going to go through that again because it would take you 4 or 5 hours to do a complete museum tour of Reagan. But anyway, nothing. I mean, the true story of why he was involved with the Vatican. I mean, all of this is covered up. And that's the main story that drives this New World Order. All of the things we hear about, what's going on today. You know, we talk about, terrorism and ISIS and how the Jesuits are involved in that. And we name names like Father Dell'Oglio, working in Syria. And it just seems to go over the heads of everybody. And as you walk through that museum, the story about the Vatican does not want to get public. So why would he institute diplomatic relations with the Vatican, since they haven't changed, when they tried to kill Lincoln and many other presidents? The answer is easy. People in America don't know anything about it. They're kept ignorant. And this Vatican-led New World Order train is moving faster and faster and faster, working together with our CIA and all the others and the Mossad. You can name all the big countries in the world. At the top levels, they all work together. And that's what should be studied if you want to stop what's going on. But anyway, back to, let's see how much time we got in this half hour. I got about 3 minutes. So I don't want to go too far here. We'll get back to Mr. Bushby's study here. And it's interesting because if you look, if you go in and do a little tour of Congress and walk in to, I believe it's the Senate or it could be the House. I always get them confused. But over the podium, the rostrum, you'll see a big, huge picture of the greatest pope, the greatest inquisitor of all of them. Okay? And I'm going to leave that up to you to tell me who that is. Then you can talk about, in the House of Representatives, the two fasci, the Roman fasci, that adorn behind the House rostrum for the Speaker. Why would that be there if we're a Democratic or a Republic? Why would a fascist symbol? Because we're basically going to be, we were formed to turn this country into fascism. And in fact, it's a democracy covered with fascism. And I'm telling you right now, the bells of Rome are ringing, telling me I've got 2 minutes to go here. There you go. There you go. But anyway, we got 2 minutes. And, there's just so many signs and symbols that tell you that this is a Roman country, that this country was formed in the Vatican had its hand in it from the beginning. And we can go to so many signs, symbols, even to the fact that Washington, D.C. was built on the territory and the grounds of, guess who? The first bishop of the Catholic Church, right? The Carroll family, all right? So there's really no secret. If everybody got an opportunity to see this stuff, laid side by side by the mainstream story, by the alternative media story, and then you put this alternative story right there, guess what? We would have a listenership of hundreds of thousands. Because, even back 10 years ago, I proved it on the biggest controlled media channels, Genesis, where Alex Jones is, and Republic, where John Stadtmiller is, controlled media, controlled COINTEL. I proved it by creating a listenership that one of the most popular shows on those stations. Because people are basically hungry for this information, but they're not getting it. And the reason they're not getting it is, one, they will marginalize you, and if you get too big, they'll kill you. And that's how they operate. So you're getting nothing from these. I go to these alternative stations and I get sick sometimes. I read what they're writing, and it's incredible. It's going to keep you away from the truth. Oh, there's a lot of fancy stuff there. It sounds great, But I'm telling you, most of it never gets to the heart of the issue. The problem, and nothing more is needed than this kind of information known to the public, Catholics or non-Catholics. And listen, we're going to be back, first show back after the break. Hope you had a good holiday. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the Scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal, and good to be back from the holidays. Hope you had a good one. And we're continuing for another year on the Investigative Journal. We started out around 2005, still going, and we rely on listeners, total listeners' subscriptions to keep us going, and free subscriptions, by the way. You can subscribe to the Investigative Journal, all the radio shows, for nothing. We only ask that maybe you donate. And for those of you who have, the few that have, thank you so much. And for those that haven't, I ask every month, well, maybe this, we go month to month here. So if you could at least put in $15 to keep the show going. I need about $1,000 to $1,500 to keep it going. So if you haven't donated, please go to my website at greganthonysjournal.wordpress.com. And you'll see a donate button there. Put it into PayPal, and it's greatly appreciated. Okay, we're talking about the true history of some of the popes, and if people knew this, if they put it side by side to what they hear in the mainstream news or even what they hear in the alternative news, I'm sure we would have hundreds of thousands of listeners. And I proved that point when years ago I worked on two of the biggest COINTEL stations in the alternative media, Republic Broadcasting and Genesis, where Alex Jones is at. And showed when I started concentrating on the Vatican, my listenership was very high and one of the most popular shows until they decided that we could not talk like we do on this radio station on those stations. And guess why? Because they're controlled by the very people we talk about. So anyway, I proved that point. And let's see if we can keep the show going. And I appreciate if you could at least put in $15 or $20, keep me going this month. Thank you so much. So we'll continue with Tony Bushby, and he's talking about the way these popes really acted in the past, and they're no different today, folks. Really no different. They just do it more deceptively. They don't go charging, leading a cavalry on their white horse to cut off the heads of Protestants. But I'll tell you, the bloodshed they're responsible for is just as bad today. But heretics they were, he said, regarding the popes, with many popes publicly admitting disbelief in the gospel story. Now, I always say Catholicism is not Christianity, and if they don't believe in the gospel, then how can they be called Christian? Just a fact. And these facts are well known to Catholic historians, by the way, who dishonestly tell their readers that the popes were virtuous and competent men with soaring religious minds. And, soaring religious minds? What about the Pope, I think it was Pope Pius IX, in the 1800s, who he was a maniacal pope, if you read his history, who was instrumental. He was the one, along with the Jesuit thugs, who passed the doctrine of infallibility. Yes, now everyone thinks the Pope is Christ on earth. Catholics do anyway. When in fact before the 1800s nobody did. How did that happen? Well, if you read the story in a book called How the Pope Became Infallible by Bernard Hassler, a high-level Vatican priest who was killed, although they said he died naturally. He was in good health in his 40s, and 3 days after he sent a letter to Pope John Paul II asking, please get rid of this doctrine, and his book backing up how crazy it was that it was started anyway in the 1800s, he conveniently died for them. Conveniently for them, by the way. And I think he was killed. And there wasn't much about the autopsy records or his death. It's really interesting. Bernard Hassler, How the Pope Became Infallible. That shows you that they really didn't have soaring religious minds. The reality of the matter is that they were intent upon their own interests alone, not those of God, and cultivated a system of papal vice larger than Catholic writers of the church history dared to reveal openly today. They were resented by the laity back then, and when better economic conditions awakened the minds of a developing European middle class, there was widespread rebellion against them. Christian records show that popes were clearly a long way removed from the modern-day presentation of their character, and in trying to portray them with a pious past, the Church developed a doctrinal facade that brazenly and deceptively presents them as devout. With the late 20th century model of the papacy in one's mind, it's difficult to imagine what it would have been like in the 16th or 14th centuries, let alone the 10th or the 8th. The now called expounders of Christian virtue were brutal killers. Quote, crimes against the faith were high treason, and as such were punishable with death. You can find that in the Catholic Encyclopedia. Popes waded through rivers of blood to attain their earthly objectives, and many personally led their episcopal militia into the field of battle. Folks, today they don't ride their white horses into battle, but behind the scenes, their rivers of blood are even larger today. And when you start looking at the deception, what about how we talked about Lorenzo Ricci and the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, and all the hidden facts that should be out in the open regarding how the Jesuit general was behind and should be considered one of our founding fathers. What about Pope Pius XII being behind Hitler, actually his mentor? What about Father Joseph Stalin, actually a Jesuit priest, who from his seat at Georgetown University, a Jesuit priest named Father Walsh, the head of our he started our Foreign Diplomatic School of Service there at Georgetown. He started the School of Foreign Service. He's got a page on Ike's website, Eisenhower's website. He actually went to Russia and was behind Stalin. It's incredible, and nothing's ever said about it. So it exists today. Exists, yes. They wade through rivers of blood even today, and the church orders today, like it did back then, its secular arm to force its dogma upon humanity by mass murder. And the clergy, discharging in district the functions of local state officials, seem never to have quite regained their religious spirit. Apologetic contributors, says Bushby, to Christian history vainly try to portray an air of sophistry about a papal past that scandalized Europe for centuries, and one that is clearly unsophisticated and primitive. You know, as the line of popes begins obscurely, we shall begin the assessment in the year 896. Yep, it's good to go back in time. They have never changed, folks. When a body, quote, of nobles with swinish and brutal lusts, many of whom could not write even their own names, and you can find that in a book called The Annals of Hincmar, Archbishop of Reims, published in 905, captured the papacy and drew it to a close in 631. Years later, in 1527, when under the subterfuges of Pope Clement VII, Rome fell to the army of Emperor Charles V. In this brief evaluation, says Bushby, of just a few popes of these centuries, we read, quote, on the death of Pope Formosus, 896, there began for the papacy a time of deepest humiliation, such it has never been experienced before or since. After the successor of this pope, Boniface VI, had ruled only 15 days, Stephen VII was raised to the papal chair. In his blind rage, Stephen not only abused the memory of Formosus, the pope, but also treated his body with indignity. Pope Stephen was strangled in prison in the summer of 897, and the 6 following popes to 904. So you got 6 more between 897 and 904. Their elevation to the struggles of the rival political parties. Christophorus, the last of them, was overthrown by Sergius III, 904 to 911. You can find that in the Catholic Encyclopedia. Such periods of deepest humiliation to the papacy were quite recurrent. Does this sound like Christ on earth? Huh? And have been even into the 21st century, when the extent of priesthood pedophilia has been publicly exposed. You know, you read that fainted apology by John Paul II in March of 2002. But it was Pope Stephen VII and the VI, a gouty and gluttonous old priest, who ordered the rotting corpse of Pope Formosus to be exhumed from its grave of 8 months, tied up into a chair, and put on trial for transgressions of the canons. In front of his his crumbling body, and dressed in purple and gold regalia, stood the Pope, his bishops, the nobles of Rome, and Lamberto of Tuscany. Wouldn't you like to have been there? Oh, God. They take the body of the Pope out. Oh, my God. And then try him after he's dead. Okay. That's Christ on earth, I bet. Yes, it is. Sounds like, yeah. Okay. The trial was a grotesque and obscene farce. The Pope paced backwards and forwards and shrieked at the corpse, declaring it guilty. A deacon standing beside the decomposing body of the ex-Pope answered on its behalf. In this macabre incident, today piously called the Cadaver Synod, The deceased pope was duly condemned, stripped of his vestments, 3 fingers cut from his right hand, and his remains dumped into the river Tiber. Quote, in this disgusting business, he, Pope Stephen VII, cannot be excused for what followed. In declaring the dead pope deposed, he was annulled of all his acts, including his ordinations. His grim and grisly role provoked a violent reaction in Rome, and in late July and early August, Pope Stephen was imprisoned and later strangled. You can get that in The Popes, A Concise Biographical History, page 160. Morbid in its realism, the mental limitations of ancient popes is thus shown to you clearly. From these and similar displays, we understand why the monks at the some monks at this, I think it's Euglemenopolis Monastery, today called Mount Casino, described described it as an abode of wrath, a charnel house, a place of exotic vice and crime, the unholy reign of the whores. The Bishop of Cremona, whose Antipodes treats papal, I don't even know what that word is. I don't know why they put words in that I don't know. But that's what happens sometimes. Treats papal history from 886 to 950. Left a remarkable picture of the vice of the popes and their episcopal colleagues, maybe with a little jealousy. It said, they hunted on horses with gold trappings, had rich banquets with dancing girls. When the hunt was over, and these are popes, folks, yeah, and retired with these shameless whores to bed with silk sheets and gold embroidered covers. All the Roman bishops were married, and their wives made silk dresses out of the sacred vestments. Their lovers were the leading noble ladies of the city, and, quote, 2 voluptuous imperial women, Theodora and the daughter of Marsolia, ruled the papacy of the 10th century. Renowned Vatican historian Cardinal Caesar Bonorius, from 1538 to 1607, called it the rule of the whores, which really gave place to even the more scandalous rule of the whoremongers. Now, let me just make an aside to you. When I was to talk about the whores, the street of the whores, when I was in Rome back in the 80s, I was on a street right parallel to the Vatican, and there's a long street there, and I used to have coffee, and I got to know the bar owner, and on that street now are all these stores that sell holy water, rosaries, all the statues, and then you have coffee shops, and etc. But back until World War II was over, it used to be called the Strada di Butani, which is the street of the whores, because on the second floor were all the whores that would service the Vatican priests. And that was told to me by a longtime resident and confirmed by many. That street, however, has been moved to a place farther away from the Vatican now that there's so many tourists, and they want to clean up their name, just like they wanted to do with all those movies by Bing Crosby after World War II here in America. Clean up that Vatican name. And they used Hollywood, and they cleaned up the street of the whores. So back then, it was the rule of the whores. So let's see, they haven't really changed, have they? Now, John X is chiefly remembered as a military commander. He's a pope, right? But a military commander. He took to the field in person against the Saracens and defeated them. He indulged in nepotism or the enrichment of his family, and his conduct prepared the way for a deeper degradation of the papacy. He invited the Hungarians, who at this time were still half-civilized Asiatics, to come and fight his enemies. And thus he brought a new and terrible plague upon his country. He had no principles in his diplomatic, political, or private conduct. He spurned Theodora, the rule during the time of the ruler of the whores, and enticed the charming young daughter of Hugh of Provence into his papal bedroom. Spurned, Theodora then married Guido Marquis of Tuscany, and together they carried out a coup d'etat against John X. Theodora died suddenly by suspected poisoning, and John X entered into a bitter quarrel with Marsolia and the leading nobles of Rome. John had brought his brother Peter to Rome, raised him to the rank of nobility, and heaped upon him the profitable offices which the elder nobles had come to regard as their preserve. It was an integral struggle for power. The nobles, led by Marozia, M-A-R-O-Z-I-A, get it right, Greg, drove Peter, Pope John, and their troops from the city. The Pope and his brother increased their army and returned to Rome. But a body of Marozia's men cut their way into the Lateran Palace and murdered Peter before the Pope's eyes. John was captured, declared deposed in 928, and smothered to death with a pillow in Castel Sant'Angelo. I know where Castel Sant'Angelo is. Marzia and his faction then appointed Leo VI in 928, the new Pope, but replaced him 7 months later with Stephen VIII. He ruled for 2 years, and then Marzia gave the papacy to her son, John XI, 910 to 936. He was illegitimately, by Sergius III, as confirmed by Floridot, a reliable contemporary writer. Sergius had previously taken the papacy by force with the help of Marzoia's mother, Theodora. You know, it reminds me, you heard about that illegitimate son of the Pope. When I was in Rome, it was during the reign of John Paul II, the cyanide salesman from Poland. I'm, of course, Polish. And the Italian guys that got to know me in jest would say, "I know why you're here, Gregory. You're the illegitimate son of the Pope coming to get your money," and they'd all laugh. It is commonly believed that Pope Sergius, although a middle-aged man, formed a union with the young Marozia, and by her had a son, the future Pope John XI. Most of the information we have on the career of Marozia and the Roman scandals in which she and a series of popes were involved is derived from hostile sources and may be exaggerated. The popes, and you can see that in a book called The Popes, A Concise Biographical History. You know, and Mr. Tony goes on, and we got about 6 minutes here, so we'll move. We'll continue with this. It's pretty interesting. It shows you the background that, this is the background of what is now called the leader of all churches, Christianity. It's crazy. And people buy it. All you can do is say, how can any good come out of this organization? And it hasn't. They've just covered it up now. They're just deceptive now. Now, let's see what we have to hear. There's a painting. It's reproduced from the 17th century edition of a book called Antipodososis, a 1,000-year-old text written by Bishop Liutprand of Cremona. They had funny names back then. Make it simple. John, Paul, Ringo, and George. I'm telling you, they probably... Why don't we have a Pope Ringo? Yeah, that's what we need. Okay, who died in... this Pope Bishop died in 972 of Cremona, Bishop of Cremona. It purports to show Pope Stephen VII overseeing the exhumation of Pope Formosus. Remember we talked about the corpse. In readiness for its ritual. An interesting aspect of this painting is the Pope's headgear reminiscent of the crown of horns worn by the Caesar clan. Okay. The sacerdotal dictatorship of Marzio, wish she had an easy name like Mary. It's M-A-R-O-Z-I-A. I'll call her Mary. Ruled Christianity for several decades. From the papal castle near St. Peter's, and dealt with everything Christian, quotes, in quotes, except routine matters. She could not sign her own name, yet she was the head of the Christian church, a fact known to historians who have at least an elementary acquaintance with the papal record. She was amorously aggressive, callous, densely ignorant, and completely unscrupulous. She appointed ruthless warrior bishops to strengthen her factions, and she triumphed in her rule over opponents. To translate the words of the Roman people literally, they called her, quote, the Pope's whore, and she was directly responsible for selecting and installing at least 4 popes. Modern-day apologists say her promotions were scandalous. but those popes are now accepted by the Church as, quote, legitimate successors of St. Peter. Oh, isn't it crazy? At the time, however, large bodies of good folk deeply resented the obscene farce the papal religion had become and turned upon it with disdain and anger. Later in his papacy, John Paul XI took ill, and Mary temporarily installed an elderly monk in the papal chair. He subsequently refused to resign and was forcibly removed to a prison cell to be starved to death. John XI then resumed his position and exhausted his remaining wealth, hiring soldiers to restore order in Rome. The city was heavy with a feeling of revolt against the Church and the appalling clerical morals that existed throughout Italy. John XI then set out to recover and secure the rich temporal domains of the papacy, but in 936 he died. Thus, in his condensed description, we learn with amazement of the days when loose women ruled the Holy See and a Christian doctrine had not yet been developed. The papacy soared amidst new depths of wickedness. Wow. As incredible as it may seem, the papacy never sank to a lower depth of wickedness and remained in this condition for nearly 1,000 years. Christian historians airily brush aside the true nature of the popes, saying that they never regarded them as impeccable, and ignoring the fact that they committed outrages against every standard of human decency. And let me tell you, behind the scenes today, they're probably doing the exact same thing, or are doing the exact same thing. And we only have a minute or so. But let me tell you this. Let me add one paragraph. Pope John XII was another in the succession of impious popes, and he opened his inglorious career by invoking pagan gods and goddesses as he flung the dice in gambling sessions. He toasted Satan during a drinking spree and put his notorious mistress, prostitute, again, there's Marcia, in charge of his brothel in the Lateran Palace. He liked to have around him a collection of scarlet women. Okay, we'll get back to this. But there you go with the Satan worshiping. And it's no different today at the Easter Masses. When they start the Easter Masses today, they tell you right there in Latin that they're worshiping Satan. And nobody believes you. But that's what they tell you. But what are they doing? They have spread so much deception. They have propagandized so much in people's minds through Hollywood and others that even when they tell you that they're worshiping Satan at their Mass, people still won't believe it. Okay, glad you're back for the first day back of the year here on the Investigative Journal, and see you tomorrow. Have a good evening.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.